thank you so much. It's a pleasure to present this paper in front of a Peruvian crowd, so I hope it survives. So this is in some way a continuation of another paper from Christina Paxson and Norbert Schady that basically I'm exploring the long-term effects of early life health shocks. So let's begin with facts. During the last years of 1980, Peru experienced a sharp economic decline. This is GDP per capita in constant term from 1980 to 2000, and in 3 years GDP fell about 28%. Inflation rate moved from high to hyperinflation during these years. And to know exactly what is the impact on people, probably we have to guess what is the role of the government in this period. And contrary to other crises, for instance, my research assistant was from Indonesia, and for the Indonesian crisis, it seems that the government acted as implemented some policies to avoid poor people to suffer the most. In this case, it seems that this is not the case, that one of the causes of the crisis was a huge contractionary fiscal policy. I'm not going to make any normative statement about this, if this was good, bad, or recommended or not. I'm just describing the facts. So it seems that there was no counter-cyclical policy or any safety net implemented during this period. The consequences of this is that one of the consequences is that the infant mortality significantly increased during this period. This is computed taking the DHS in exactly the same way as Paxson and Schady did. The only difference between this graph and the graph that they have in the paper is that I'm taking a year and they are taking 6 months. But the rest of the paper I'm going to follow exactly what they did to tie my hands and to avoid playing with definitions. So I'm not going to work here or study here those people who died. I mean, this is certainly very important, but this is, as I mentioned, very well documented in the paper of Paxson and Schady, and they also explore mechanism of why this happened. What I'm going to explore is the long-term effect of this. So during the crisis, it could be probably naive to think that only those who die suffer health consequences. So those who did not die, what exactly are the health consequences for them? Right? Not just the short-term, but the long-term consequences. And this is exactly what this paper is about. So why do we expect a relationship between early life health and adult health? This paper is within a growing literature about early life interventions on adult health, adult economic outcomes. And the reason is that gestation and infancy are a crucial period in life. Right? It's the period when you go from a single cell at the moment of conception to develop all the organs during this period. So just to give you an idea, the brain, the size of the brain of a 2-year-old is 80% of the brain of an adult. So this is a period when all the organs grow very rapidly. But it's also a period when the person is incredibly vulnerable. When you are born, your immune system is weak. You are still developing your immune system. You're more likely to get sick. And if there are evidence that if nutrition is insufficient, the probability of catching up later is certainly limited. So these elements are particularly relevant in developing countries, of course, because there are an important fraction of the population close to subsistence. And it's even more important during economic downturns. So continuing with the relationship between early life health and long-term outcomes, there is a document at the World Health Organization suggesting, or not suggesting, concluding basically saying that there is a connection between early life health and chronic illness later in life. So I read most of the papers coming from the medical literature, and what they all of them do is basically track people over time and they compute correlations. But correlations are good because they are informative, but certainly they do not and cannot answer a policy relevant question. And is if you make an intervention in early life, what is the long-term impact, right? So this is early life health is a typical variable which is exogenous from an economic point of view, in the sense that there's nothing you can do to change it. It's predetermined, but it's endogenous from an econometric point of view. And the endogeneity comes mainly from things that are time invariant. And the two candidates for this are basically genetic traits, that you are born with genetic strains, and family background. So in both cases, let's say you were sick when you were young because you had some genetic disease, then when you are older, you're going to be sick. And there is correlation, but not causation. The same can be applied to family background. So how to analyze? There are different ways of identifying this. And one of them is what I'm using here, is basically to analyze a shock at some point in health, and then trying to track people, or trying people of the same population, to analyze the long-term impact. So I'm not going to go over all the papers for reasons of time. There are many more that are related to this. Of course, I have to be fair with Paxson and Schady, because I was inspired by that paper to do this. So what I do, let's talk about identification, to be very clear about the assumptions that I'm going to make. So if we accept the assumptions, we accept the methodology. And the crisis was for the entire country, this is true, but the crisis is never homogeneous, the impact. Right? There are people who suffer more and people who suffer less. So what I'm going to use is variation in the crisis according to socioeconomic status. Particularly, there's very good reason to pick one variable related to socioeconomic status that is time invariant, according to the methodology that I'm going to use. So I'm going to use the education of the mother. Why do I use this? Well, the rationale of the economic is that low educated mother with low levels of income, if they have to cut, usually richer people are better insured in any crisis. And even if they were exactly the same, and we have to cut exactly in the same proportion, those who are closer to subsistence are more likely to cut on basic needs, basically on food and health and so on. If you are very rich and you don't go outside and eat sushi, but you are not going to suffer more. So the approach that I'm going to take is similar to the one that Duflo did in his seminar paper about school construction in Indonesia, where I'm going to use difference in difference. Particularly, I'm going to use a set of two difference in difference embedded in an instrumental variable approach. So the short-term effect, the diff, I'm going to explore year where the children were born and mother's education. And the diff, that is in the corner, the 0.016, is basically the impact that the crisis had on the gap between children, between low-educated mothers with high levels of education and with low levels of education. This is the probability of dying in the first years of life. None of these variables can be used separately to identify the effect, for obvious reasons. Mother's education has a direct impact on the probability of dying, and the other capture cohort effect, or probably a trend that you want to eliminate. So this is the identifying assumption. The identifying assumption is the standard of a diff in diff, when you say, well, in the absence of the crisis, basically the gap between mothers with low and high levels of education, the probability of dying to a mother remains constant in the absence of the crisis. What the crisis had was increase the gap between the two. Again, following the flow, what I'm doing is to verify this assumption, I create like a placebo experiment, which simply takes two cohorts that none of them were exposed to the crisis. Right? And the diff in diff is much lower and not statistically significant. So what I'm going to do to explore the long-term effect, there is no panel data in this that covers this period, is I'm going to use a different sample representative of the same population And I'm going to perform something else, but the intuition is the same diff and diff that I'm doing here, 15 years in the future. Right? So if there is any long-term effect, I should also observe that the gap in the first should remain. So this is basically the intuition of the identification. And then I'm going to put the two things together to make some meaningful interpretation of the result. And I don't know why this is not moving. Okay. So just put some equations just to see what I tried to estimate. And ideally what I want to estimate is Y, which is some measure of long-term outcome, which is chronic illness, education, employment, and so on, as a function of early life health. Right? Where I'm going to be, in this case, early life health shock is your probability of dying, if you want. So the parameter of interest is gamma. I cannot estimate this directly. I do not observe, I don't have a panel data for this. And even if I had a panel data, there is clearly a bias over here. So the solution to this is, okay, let's put the two diff and diff in one framework, in a two-sample, two-state least square estimator. In the first stage, what I'm going to do is a diff and diff that I just showed you. Right? So if you believe in the identification conditions, the last term is going to be is caused by the crisis. So then what I'm going to do is I create the predictions of this, which is the probability of dying, right? Which is the prediction of this. And in the second stage, because I cannot run the other one, I'm going to replace this equation 2 in this equation 1. And I'm going to run the reduced form. Right? And the reduced form in this case is another diff and diff. Right? Again, beta 2, if this is significant, is giving me that there is a long-term impact. The interpretation here, most of the paper stop here, and they don't put much interpretation on this. I would like to put more interpretation. I say, if I want to estimate gamma 1, the only thing that I have to do is to divide beta 2 times alpha 2, right? Which is 2 state least square. And this is a long-term impact of early life health shock. So this is basically what I'm doing. So the data is, the first stage is the DHS, replicating almost exactly what Paxson and Schady did. And the second stage, I'm going to pull all the now surveys available so far. The reason for doing this is that I want to compare in the future people at the same age when they were 15 years old, right? So I need to pull all these variables. So just to give you more idea about what I'm estimating, I'm not going to be very precise about what is the cost of this health shock, because I don't have enough information. So what we can think is that health is going to be, based on the health when you are early life health, is a function of HI, which is your potential health. It's basically, this is the best you can do in terms of health based on genetic traits when you are born. The other elements, minus V, are all detrimental effects. Right? All detrimental effects, if we follow the standard health theory, this is consumption, leisure, health endowment, that is, well, health endowment is HI, elements in the environment, and so on. So all of these elements are going to be affected potentially by the crisis. Consumption, leisure, demand of health care, and so on. I cannot disentangle this, so I use a reduced form, and this is this is why I use a diff and diff in the first part. So when crisis and E, which is the level of education of the mother, is the dummy variable, the diff and diff is exactly when the saturating the model. This is the first stage. So this is the first stage, is the short run impact. The first column is exactly the table that I show you. It's the diff and diff put in regressions. And the rest of the columns are going to be just adding some controls, right? So, For instance, in the second case, instead of doing a diff in diff, I put year of birth fixed effects. I include some matters of age, the gender of the person, which, by the way, is positive and consistent with other studies. There is not much evidence, but there is some evidence that men tend to die more with higher probability at all ages, and this is consistent. This is consistent with that. Not due to the crisis; it's the level of this. And doing the same for the placebo experiment, basically I get, as expected, nothing, at least from a statistical point of view. And then I proceed to estimate the long-term impact. So just to be sure about what am I estimating, let me put some equation. This is far from being a structural model. But the H, what is on the left-hand side, is the long-term impact, right, on health. And then H0 is early life health. Then the other one is potential health, and G is anything that you do to compensate any health problem. Right? So when you take the expectation of this, you can decompose the total effect in three. What is known as selection, scarring, and the other one I call compensation. I don't know how to call it. So scarring is basically you get a health shock, and then the health shock lasts for the rest of the life. The selection effect comes from the fact that at the moment of the health shock, those with low health endowment tend to die more frequently. And this is the part of selection. Some people died, are not anymore in the sample. And finally, the compensation is the things, everything that people who suffer can do to overcome all the problems. So just to be fair, what I'm going to do now is estimate the entire effect, selection, scarring, plus composition effect, which is what is usually done in the literature, and then if I have time, I'm going to show you how to separate some of these effects. So this is the reduced form. This is a diff in diff, years in the future. I have two samples, one of them only with 15-year-olds and the other one with 15 to 18 years old. The reason that I'm using two samples is because for the first one I have the placebo experiment, for the second one I don't, but I have much more, many observations will give me more precision of the estimation. Right. So the second line is the diff in diff, the parameter of interest, which is positive and statistically significant, right? Which indicates that there is a long-term effect on chronic illness. This is the control, and I get nothing, again, doing exactly the same thing for the placebo experiment. And once you get that there is a long-term impact on health, on chronic illness in particular, you want to know if there is any impact on economic outcomes. There is not necessarily a connection between these. You may have diabetes and you have a treatment, and the economic outcomes, the possibility of generating income does not suffer at all. Right? So the way of estimating this is just replacing this with some variables of education, such as completing primary education or not, and it's clearly statistically significant for the two samples. Employment is not affected at all. The same for controls, it's okay. And this is the part that is the two-sample instrumental variable approach. The two-sample instrumental variable approach was originally developed by, I think, Angrist and Kruger and some other authors, that simply says an IV can be computed using different samples. Right? I'm using diff and diff mixed with this two-sample instrumental variable approach to identify the long-term effect. Why am I doing this? You say, if I get the positive result, why don't just stop here? And the reason is exactly the same when you do IVs, because you want to put meaningful interpretation, not just to say, yes, there is an impact. Okay, what is the impact, right? And the impact is like when the probability of dying, what as you can see in the table, increases by 1 percentage point. Basically, the probability of suffering chronic illness later in life, at the age of 15, increases by more than 2 percentage points. And you can do this with school enrollment, primary school or less, unemployed. As you can see, some of them are statistically significant, some of them are not. So these are the main results, and there are other things that I'm concerned. One of them is changes in the composition of mothers, in the sense that it may be that during the crisis, the more healthy mothers decided not to have children, and the unhealthy mothers decided to have children. It seems to be that there is nothing like this very important in the paper of Paxson and Schady. Nonetheless, I do two things to do a robustness check. The only thing that matters is the health condition of the mother, the long-term effect, the health endowment of the mother. So if the mother had a health shock during the crisis, this is contemplated in the estimator. This is what I am estimating. The problem is that when some mother who has some genetic problem decide to have children more during this period, is going to have the probability of having children with some genetic problem is going to be higher. This is related to health endowment. Talking about genetic traits, but it's about health endowment in general. So I have two measures of the health of the mother. One of them, used in the development literature, is the height in the DHS. This is the only measure that I have. So I include it in the regression and nothing happens. It suggests that there is nothing like this. And the other one, probably the most important one, is that I also observe if the mother has a chronic condition or not. So by including this in this regression, it's positive and significant as expected. Mothers who have chronic illness also have children who have high probability of chronic illness, but it doesn't affect the results at all. And just to mention one more thing is, and I conclude with this, I'm really going fast, is that I think almost all the papers that I have read about studying long-term impact cannot separate basically the selection effect from the scarring effect, which is what you try to estimate. And the reason for not doing this is because you cannot separate the two without additional assumptions. You cannot point identify the two. And I'm not going to point identify, but I'm going to do a partial identification in this case. So the partial identification, I'm not going to the details, but it's making, because the dependent variable is a dummy, I can make two extreme assumptions. One assumption is like if I'm putting people in the sample who died and saying if those who died had exactly the same probability of chronic illness of those who are in the sample, then we are okay. And this is the lower bound. The upper bound is coming from making the extreme assumption that the selection is complete, in the sense that if people who died had survived, they will now have chronic illness for sure with probability 1. Right? And these are the two assumptions. So I can compute the lower bound and the upper bound of the scarring effect, and the bounds are close, which are tight, which means that the best we can say with partial identification is that the scarring effect is between these two numbers. So the impact of early life health shock on chronic illness is between 2.19 to 2.67. So let me conclude that what I'm studying here is the long-term effect of the Peruvian crisis, and it seems that it has clearly a long-term impact on chronic illness, and chronic illness has an impact on education of people at the age of 15. So from a methodological point of view, I'm combining a set of difference in difference estimator in an instrumental variable approach. And I'm going to conclude here.
The paper has, I think, two main contributions. One in terms of trying to identify the impact of the Peruvian crisis, and second, it kind of, it goes beyond the reduced form approach and tries to capture some structural estimates of the impact of the crisis. But I will focus now on the reduced form results, because I think that's where we probably need to explore it a bit more. So just to summarize what Federico showed to us is that so he looked at short-term effects of the economic crisis, and basically he was saying, so the crisis took place between 1988 and 1990, and the comparison period is from 91 to 93. And comparing those two periods, he found that there were effects on infant mortality, negative effects on infant mortality for those that were affected by the shock, and there were also long-term effects in terms of chronic diseases and in terms of education. And the identification strategy relies on a diff in diff estimator. In particular, he defines two groups: the group of people who have mothers that were high educated, and those who had mothers who were low educated. And the assumption is sort of that the high educated is the control group in the sense that they shouldn't have been affected by the shock. And he also runs some control experiments trying to make that clear. So I think in this case it's very important to think in terms of the context in which this crisis took place. And one thing that worries me is in terms of how to interpret the results is that many things happened during this period. So those born in the late 80s that were going through the early childhood period during these years, they were affected by the crisis. They were also affected by something else, which was the conflict, the internal conflict that took place in Peru over those years. I put a graph here, which is from my own research, but basically this is the intensity of the conflict in Peru by region between 1980 and 2000, and you can see that although there is a lot of variation within regions, a lot of things were going on in the late 80s in the country. But the author mentions this in the paper, but it's important to put it in context. And the other thing is that the comparison period, so the economic crisis took place in the late 80s, and then the comparison period are the early 90s. But during the early 90s, many things also happened. So we had the economic recovery period, and if we think in terms of education as an outcome, well, we had a very large-scale program of school infrastructure. Many primary schools were built during the sort of mid-90s, and that also, it's not really clear at some point if we're actually looking at the impact of the crisis, at the negative impact of the crisis, or at the positive impact of what happened in the 90s. Well, so thinking of this, one thing that I think we should try to put it more clear is that, say for instance, someone that was born in 1987 is assumed to be in the control group, but actually he was affected during the second and third year of life, during the critical period of the early childhood. Someone who was born in 91, it is true that he was born after the shock, but he spent the intrauterine period during the shock, during the crisis. So I think, a few things that could be done is, so first, I think there could be sort of a division. So you have the economic crisis period, there should be some space in blank, and then the comparison period, because there are some people in between that were sort of affected partially by the shock, but not fully. So, and they are actually part of the control group right now. I think they should be excluded. And I think it will also be important to have more years, more birth cohorts in the analysis. So sort of to have 2 cycles of the economy will be useful to better identify the impact of the crisis. So more data, more birth cohorts, I think that will be useful. In terms of the diff in diff strategy, so you know, the assumption is quite clear. I was not fully convinced by the idea that those people born from high educated mothers were a proper control group, in the sense, well, okay, the complication here is so one would think that everyone was affected maybe, but it is true that the poor people were more affected. So okay, so but that has implication for the results in terms of so you know, so it means there was a general effect for everyone, and you're capturing is the marginal effect for the poor. So I think that should be said more explicitly in the discussion. Now, in terms of you do something nice about, you know, to illustrate the strategy, you use a control experiment, which I think is quite good, because you sort of seem to confirm there is a common trend in the two groups. However, I think it will be useful to add, for instance, a pre-crisis control experiment. So to have two control experiments, the one you have after the crisis, but also possibly another before the crisis. So that will be more. That will make it more clear that there is actually a common trend in these two groups. And also something else. I mean, if you only think about people with high educated and low educated mothers, the problem is that in Peru that typically means that women that have very low education come from rural areas typically. So what you could be actually looking at is at the difference between urban and rural people. So you have a very strong effect in rural areas where mothers have very low educations, but not in urban areas. So I think you should really think about controlling for urban and rural location in the model, because it's not really clear what you're capturing here right now. But also perhaps to add geographical fixed effects to more generally take into account the fact that, yes, but not in all the estimations, only in the one for infant mortality, I believe. Oh, well, okay, so then maybe when I look at the tables, I saw that that the exercise of finding district fixed effects was done for the infant mortality estimates, but okay. So I think this will be really important to add in general, maybe even from the beginning, actually. Now, in terms of the outcomes, just some general questions, which is chronic diseases. I think it's makes sense in the narrative of the paper. It will be important to say which type of chronic diseases might be taking place for people that are age 15, because some chronic diseases might become more important as people get older. So it will be useful to understand which chronic diseases could be in the sample. Although I know the question is not in the national survey, but you could add more narrative there. In terms of education, as I was saying, it was not clear to me because in the 90s there was a large school infrastructure program that took place. So it's not really clear if what you're looking at is the negative impact of the economic crisis or the positive impact of the school infrastructure program that took place, after this. Well, in terms of employment, you didn't find any result. I think it's probably too early to look at this variable because these kids are quite young. And then a final thing, which is, I think it's very clear. I mean, I think the result is very clear that something really bad happened in the early 80s and that affected infant mortality. I think that's, in the graph you put, it's very clear. But in order to look at the long-term effects, I think it will be useful to look at other health outcomes that were affected in the short term. Maybe nutrition is one possible outcome. So you could say many children died, and those that survived were affected in the short term from a nutritional point of view, say, for instance, a variable. And then because of that, we might observe some long-term effects. So I think something in between should be very useful. No? Beyond infant mortality, something in the short term that affected the health of these kids that you could observe in the DHS, you could estimate, and then based on that story, then say, well, many children died, and then those that survived had health problems. So because of that, we are actually observing some long-term effects.
When you say treatment control, I never said in this paper that I'm going to estimate the impact of the crisis. The title of the crisis is the long-term impact of health, not of the crisis. What I'm saying is that the diff in diff is not used to estimate the average treatment effect of the crisis. It's used as an instrument in the two-step sample, right? So this has to be very clear. So the other comment, the only thing that you have to believe to identification is that the gap increased. If it was, of course, it may be that everybody suffer and the poor suffer most. And this is the only thing that I need for identification. I'm not estimating the impact of the crisis. I never said this. So solving this is answering many of the questions here. So with respect to using pre-period, then in purpose I didn't use this for two reasons. One of them, there was a short crisis before this one. And the other one is, if they are alive, you don't know if they were affected or not. They are people who were already born. So those, by using the cohort immediately after that, then I'm sure that these people were not there. I'm sure that I understand. Maybe they had an impact when they were inside the mother. Maybe, but if I have a significant result, this is the only thing that I need for identification. Because I'm not estimating, I repeat, I'm not estimating the impact of the crisis. This is not, I'm giving you the average treatment effect of the crisis is this. What I'm giving you is the impact of increasing your probability of dying. And this is given, remember, in an instrumental variable approach, the first step does not have to be well specified, in the sense that you can have a misspecified first step and you can have identification in the second one. If you have a clean interpretation of the first step, good. You can have a structural thing and you can have more interpretation. But the first step, if you have, I mean, it's misspecified, the solution is so what? It's misspecified, but it's good as an instrument still for that. And this is what I'm using here. So with respect to conflicts, I think I addressed this, I don't know if perfectly, but there is a published paper by Gianmarco Leon about this that finds effects. So what I say is, okay, I'm going to do exactly what he does to see if I can eliminate my impact or not. And the results does not change at all when I follow. So maybe other things going on, maybe. And with respect to school construction, when they were 1 year old, I don't know if they are very impacted. I mean, the cohort, you say that cohort after the crisis, then the government started to build schools, but okay, but this is a diff in diff after all, right? So the cohort effect is eliminated because this is the idea of the diff in diff. I'm not doing a time series analysis, I'm doing a diff in diff. So this is certainly not a problem. Everything that happens for everybody in the same cohort. Exactly. But this is why. Okay, I take the point. This is one of the reasons to include a placebo experiment is to avoid all these type of things. And I don't know if there is something else that I did not answer. With respect to other variables, I would love to know exactly what chronic disease is, but I don't know. I mean, there are things that I observe and things that I do not observe. Oh, okay. Yes, definitely. Yes. It's just something that I can say, but not that I can measure. And respect if I'm measuring the crisis or the boom, I don't care. This is the first stage. As I said, this is an instrumental variable approach. The first stage can be whatever, as long as we believe that the change in the health is exogenous, then that's the only thing that I need for identification.